everyone. Welcome to this week's Friday presentation. Today we're going to be presenting a paper called Stumbling Blocks, Stress Testing the Robustness of Machine-Generated Text Detectors Under Attacks. I'm Griffin Higgins, so let's kick it off. So who am I for those of you who might not know? My name is Griffin Higgins. I'm a PhD student here at the Faculty of Computer Science. I'm also a cybersecurity software developer at CIC. A fun fact about myself is that I love nerdy things. I always change this up every week, and this week, this is my personal little IoT lab. It has two little Raspberry Pis, and they kind of light up in a little rack. So yeah, that's the other IoT lab. So for the agenda today, we're going to be looking at the paper. It's more of just a review and to just show off some of the different kinds of attacks that can occur, as well as the detectors and everything about this paper that I think is really, really interesting. We're going to start with the motivation. We're going to look at the pipeline, the generators, the detectors, and then for each attack, we're going to kind of like go over what the attack is, or the attacks in that category. We're going to look at the results, and then we're going to look at the path that's suggested for it, if there is one. At the very end, we're going to go over the findings and conclusions of the paper, and then I'll share some of my thoughts and critiques. So motivation. Hopefully it's pretty common knowledge that large language models have hallucinogenic tendencies in that they don't always give you reliable things. So for example, and you can also ask it anything. So if I wanted to say, hey, pretty please, will you just do my PhD for me? It'll give me a response. And unfortunately, it'll say, no, I can't do that for you. But most importantly, we can also say, right even at the bottom of ChatGPT, it says ChatGPT can make mistakes. Check important info. So whatever important is also up for debate. But you can't necessarily trust what you're getting back. So that's just one way that we might want to detect where this happens in the wild so that we can understand what is and isn't machine-generated text. There is another case. Where these models might be used for harms. So instead of asking it to do my PhD for me, I might say, hey, please generate a phishing email and tell people to send Bitcoin to my email address. Presumably this can scale, and we can all understand that this might be an important and adaptive threat in the future. So you might say, okay, just build a detector and detect if a given text is either going to be machine-generated text or human-written text. And this works for the first case. This works for the first case because all I'm saying is, hey, do my PhD for me, and it will give me a bunch of text that I'll just submit from this generator. But maybe this doesn't work in the second case. Does anyone want to take a jab at why this might not work in the second case? No? Well, it wouldn't work in the second case because if we draw from ideas surrounding cryptography and cryptology, we can adopt some of Cherkov's views on the detector as being a system, right? And most importantly, Cherkov posits that in his second rule, the system is not secret. So presumably, the adversary in this scenario actually has a copy of the detector. Meaning that if I'm trying to generate these phishing emails, I know there's a detector on the other side that I have to beat before I can get those phishing emails out to people. But if I have this detector, I can even take my own samples, test it against the detector, and see how well I might be doing. So with this understanding, it's important to develop not only accurate machine-generated text detectors, but also robust machine-generated text detectors so that people can't launch these kinds of attacks at scale. So at a high level view, essentially we're doing kind of this idea where we might have two distributions, one that's going to be human written text and another that might be machine generated text. Given that we have the detector, we might launch some kind of attack to bring these distributions closer, and then hopefully after the fact, we might launch some kind of patch to bring the distributions further out and hopefully better classify these attacks after their launch. So, in terms of a pipeline, the authors devise several kinds of objects. So they consider the generators, like i.e. the things generating the text, the different kinds of attacks that can happen that we're going to cover today. There's a lot of them, so we're going to be moving pretty quick. They also consider a budget. We're going to go over what this is, as well as the detector itself. So they consider lots of different ones. Lastly, they rank the relative performance of the detector against the budget in terms of how much you actually have to perturb the given text that you're trying to get past this detector to see how well it gets past the detector. So in terms of generators, we're going to go over a couple of the objects. We see that there's many open source generators that are considered in the work. So GPT-2 XL, GPT-J, Llama 2, as well as some closed source these are the generators, as well as some closed source generators. So DaVinci 3 and GPT-4, meaning that I can't actually see the internal workings of these things or mess with them. It's just kind of on a cloud platform. All I can do is maybe submit a prompt and get back a response. Versus for the open source generators, I might be able to do something to them and see their inner workings when I'm generating text. So okay, these are some of the generators, but what about the detectors? So the authors consider three kind of families of detectors, so mainly metric-based detectors. These mainly use like log probability thresholds to determine whether or not a given text is from a machine. We can understand that even when we're using our iPhones kind of analogously, when we start to type out text, we might see like little completions pop up. Some of those might be more likely or less likely to occur than others. So this kind of looks at those metric-based metrics to determine if something is going to be machine-generated or not. There's also fine-tuned detectors. So if we have this big supervised training set and we perturb some of the samples, we can also go through and just retrain a BERT model and see what happens. Lastly, there's also watermarking-based detectors. So these basically just add a token level bias after decoding to determine whether or not someone on the other side has perturbed the text instead. In the work, they evaluate these based on the ACROC curves and the true positive rate at a given false positive rate. So these are more or less just the attack success rates. They also don't consider the accuracy or the F1 scores, as they depend mostly on the threshold set by the metric detectors, which can be biased. So we also noted this thing called like the budget. So we want to understand how much we have to perturb a given text in order to get it past a given detector. There's lots of different ways to measure this, and some of them are specific to certain kinds of attacks. So for example, if we launch a misspelling attack, we might just want to see how many characters do we have to move around and transpose in certain ways, and just count the number of times we do that, and see if we do it for a certain count, what's the percentage impact on robustness for a given detector. So there's lots of different scores, and they relate to the different detectors. Additionally, there's also this kind of notion of a human evaluation, because we can talk about the robustness of the detectors in terms of just pure metrics, but at the end of the day, the goal is to get this past the detector and also be legible for a human, so that it can also be impactful in that way, not just that we were trying to beat the detector. Because if that were the case, we could just replace any text with the, maybe, and say that we've beaten the detector, which wouldn't be true. So yeah, that also gets at the point at the very bottom here. So coming back to this pipeline, we now have an idea about some of the things that are in it in terms of the generators and the detectors and the different kind of budgets. But something we haven't talked about is the attacker or the various attacks that can be launched itself. So in the work, the authors basically consider the difference between human written text and unattacked MGT text. How they create their samples is they have this data set from news sources, and they take the first 20 tokens of this kind of true human written text, and they supply it as input to a given generator. The generator will then return some amount of text that we can say, we can then compare. So that's kind of how samples are generated. There's about 8,000 training samples, 1,000 evaluation samples, and 1,000 test samples. After this, we might also recognize the difference between the MGT samples. So we see here in yellow, this part's going to be kind of more or less the prompt. In orange, it'll be anything that it outputs. We can also see the same thing in the watermarked case. So we can see the prompt in yellow and then the watermarked text in blue. So the main difference here is that this is what is being returned to us from the generator, right? And we may or may not have control over what we get back over if it's going to be a closed source or an open source generator. So in the closed source case, we might not have control over if it will be watermarked or not. And we'll see some of this in the various attacks. So starting off, and this is also an example of one of the attacks. So we might see if there's some original machine-generated text, an adversary might perturb it below So for example, typo insertion for about 20% of the tokens, we're just going to go and misspell a couple words and just see what happens. So that's kind of, and that's going to be in red for reference going forward. So now that we kind of have an idea about how the samples are going to be laid out, how we're going to actually kind of understand and assess them, let's start going over some of the various attacks. So the most simple attacks are just the editing attacks. And here we don't really need much experience to conduct these attacks. We also don't need any kind of model to conduct these attacks. We can just go misspell words ourselves if we really wanted to. We also don't really need access to the generator to maybe move it around while it's generating text. This is all a post-generation step. So starting with the typo insertion at the very top, we again are going to see our unattacked machine-generated text. And down beneath, we'll see that we just start to misspell a bunch of words. So for example, instead of newspapers, we might see newspapers. And yeah, that's just one kind of attack. Another kind of attack is the homoglyph alteration attack. So instead of trying to misspell words, we instead substitute them with their respective homoglyphs. So we might consider like a regular E instead of this kind of like caret on the top. There's probably a better term for that, but we can understand that these aren't originating from directly the English language, perhaps. But we can still see that semantically the words are the same. That's still an E to me and to you. It just might have a little bit of character perturbation on top. So the last one is the character format, or the format character editing attack. I don't really like this term. I think it'd be better just to say special character insertion attack. And by special character, we might consider a character of white space that's of no length. So we literally, this is the same text to us, but to a machine or something trying to process this, there's actually tons of characters in white space here that we can't see. That would make a difference for it, presumably. So these are kind of the editing attacks. We might want to understand what on earth happens when we launch these against the various detectors. So we can see that the typo mix attack has a pretty large impact on most of the detectors. You can see the ROC-AUC curve going down for a lot of the detectors as we increase the budget. So for example, here down below, we can see like 0, 4, 8, 12. That would be like the actual number of transpositions and things that we might be misspelling. Similarly for like the homoglyph and the format character attack. So we can see that even with this very naive kind of thing, we can have a very large impact on most of the detectors. Importantly, one of the findings we'll get to later is that the watermark detector, as well as a couple of the others in certain cases, will still perform quite well. So this is the results for the editing attacks. Suggested patches for the editing attacks included specifically for Detect GPT, one of the detectors, to try and just filter out the top K tokens with the lowest probabilities. So if you see something that's never come up before, just filter out the top K of them and repeat as if you'd be going through the text normally. Also, in terms of just general patches for the editing attacks, adversarial training is suggested. Visual character embeddings are also suggested, so to detect the homoglyphs, I would say, as well as grammatical error correction, so like a spell checker. Just go through and try and spell check all the words and replace them before you let it go through your model. This sounds kind of trivial, but how do we even classify if something is going to be misspelled? Might be a little trickier than we imagine, but still these might work. So okay, that's the editing attacks. What about the next kind of step, which are known as paraphrasing attacks, which occur kind of at the word level, or the inner sentence level, or the inner sentence level. So here we need a model, except for the synonym attack or the synonym substitution attack. In that case, we might either use like an offline thesaurus or some kind of information, or literally get output back from some kind of generator on how to substitute the words. So we might say, hey, ChatGPT, here's a word, give me a bunch more words like it, then we can try and substitute them. Importantly, we don't actually still need access to the generator. This is still a post-generation attack. So, yeah. Also, looking at the synonym substitution, we can kind of see different things occur. So for example, Pole might be substituted with crown, American might be substituted with like American English, news might be substituted with news show, similarly, and so forth. So that's pretty interesting, and again, this is happening kind of at the word level. Synonym substitution. Okay, maybe the title isn't correct here. Oh, sorry, no, it is. This is for the model based. So the previous one was just if we have this offline dictionary, and now if we have like an actual model that we call out to get synonyms back, it might start to make larger changes. So for example, depending on solely newspapers or magazines instead of newspapers or magazines, these kinds of things. So now we're going to look at the kind of the span perturbation. So again, here, we need a model for this, and we also need to define various kinds of spans. So in the text, we can see that it might also be altering the whole, like the prompt aspect, because again, this is a post-generation attack. So we might instead see that instead of more Americans, we might see that more people choose. So these kinds of things to perturb the text. And then lastly, we might see second lastly, we might see an inner sentence paraphrasing attack, where we literally just take a whole sentence, give it to a model, and say, hey, give me another sentence that is kind of similar to this. And in their work, they use Pegasus for this. And then lastly, the inter-sentence paraphrasing attack, where we literally just say, hey, rephrase this whole thing. And we might wonder, okay, well, what are the results on the detectors after we do this? A lot of them kind of start to drop off at the word substitution level for the offline and online attacks, but not so much for the other kinds of attacks involving models. My hypothesis is just that at the word level, we're still doing something very similar to the character editing attacks, versus where at the span level and the inner sentence level and things like this, we're essentially just trying to call out to another model to say, hey, try and pass this detector as a model that's trying to detect you as a model. So it's kind of this game that I don't really think you can easily get around, because the detector is trying to detect a model. Yeah, so that's for paraphrasing. Considering some of the patches for paraphrasing, there's no direct patches suggested. Some of the detectors are already kind of robust, so if we go back, we can kind of see at the very top, some of them still stay near that line, so use those detectors. Watermarking is impacted at the inner sentence level. So again, if we rephrase the whole text, whatever watermark might have been there is probably not going to be the same thing. So that's why it might not be as impactful in this case. Moving on to the code generation attacks. I had a hard time understanding this at the very start, but essentially this happens like on generation. So as the model is generating text, we might like stop it and then insert a token and then let it keep generating text. This sounds kind of strange, but it is not model free. So you actually need like an open source detector here to do stuff. And again, here they're doing things at the inner sentence and the inter sentence level. You need decoding access to the model, that's what I should have said. So yeah, in terms of the code generation attacks, we might say after it's done generating sentence, we would insert an emoji, and then we would let it keep generating some text, where we would insert another emoji and let it keep generating text. After everything is said and done, we just go through and remove the emojis. And the whole point of this is just so that there's a lot of random things that are coming up in the model. Since it's using the previous tokens, it's auto-regressive to predict the next token, just like your kind of iPhone might in a more trivial way. But yeah, so we remove that and just see what happens. The other thing would be the typo code generation. So after it's finished generating some kind of sentence, we go and perturb some of the tokens and then keep letting it generate more text. So when we do this, we see the results for the code generation attacks. For the metric-based models in blue, they kind of just drop off a cliff. Some of the other ones stay up, so that's good. And there aren't really any patches discussed, mainly because like some of the green models kind of stay around that good threshold, and the watermarking is still an effective detection. The last set of attacks we're going to be talking about are the prompting attacks. So here we don't need a model on our side to do the perturbations on the text itself. because again, this is before the text is even generated as an attack, but we do need prompt level access to the generator. So if we go to OpenAI, even if it's a closed source generator, we can still give it a prompt and say, hey, do this thing. And it targets the inner sentence level, so it's going to be the whole text that's generated and given back to us, because again, we don't actually have the model. When we look at the prompt paraphrasing attack, essentially it's going to take that piece of yellow text that we see up above and say, hey, give it to another model, and say, paraphrase this for me, and then continue on. And maybe it'll have more diversity, maybe it might be a little longer or a little shorter, who knows. But we can kind of see that, again, the whole output of the text is returned back to us, presumably doing something a little bit different. So there's also in-context learning, so where we basically show the model some examples while we're prompting it. So we might say, hey, I literally want you to turn watermarked text into like attacked kind of text, and keep going forward, and also maybe give it like a negative case. So don't take the text that you currently have and transform it into the text that you currently have, for example. So after all these things are said and done, there's one last prompt-based attack. So here we might say to the model, if it is sufficiently powerful, I want you to do all the things that I just asked you to do, but while you're doing it, I also want you to substitute every S with a Z. So this kind of instruction is important because, again, the model is going to look at previous tokens in order to make inference decisions about what token next to generate. And if it's literally creating its own spelling mistakes, then it presumably will kind of give us this out of distribution sample. And since we know that it's substituting all the S's with the Z's, we can just go back through the text after we get it back and resubstitute the Z's with S's, and then ship it off to our detector to hopefully be beaten. Yeah, so this is kind of actually the thing I just described. I forgot I had it here. But some of the results for the prompting attack, we can see that it drops some of the detectors quite low. I don't think they put a plot here just because there's so many things to consider. So yeah. Moving on, some of the patches for the prompt-based attacks include fine-tuning on the multi-generator, multi-domain datasets, i.e. like the M4 dataset by Wang et al. So this is actually a dataset we used for our NLP course project on adversarial training to resolve some of these issues. And it includes kind of 3 different scenarios. One is to actually classify, like a binary classification on human written text versus machine generated text. The second is on differentiating between the different types of generators for the machine generated text. So is it from OpenAI? Is it from Llama 3? All those kinds of things. And then the last kind of task in this data set was I give you some text that has human written text and machine generated text mixed in. Tell me where the machine generated text is. So those are all things that are included in that data set. It's a very interesting data set, and I agree with that patch suggestion. They also suggest ensembling base metric detectors with fine-tuned detectors. I'm not sure how I feel about that. And then they also suggest a patch against character substitution, or there's no patch suggested against character substitution generation, unfortunately. So that's a big problem. And then the findings are that across all the detectors, they create this leaderboard, and anything that you see kind of in a orange box, the detection rate dropped by about 70%. This is averaged across all the different budgets, so that's kind of why the numbers might not make a lot of sense. We can also see in some cases they go over 100%. So after being perturbed, it actually gives an increase. So that's kind of interesting where that happens, but it doesn't happen all across the board. And then the bold cases are the best for each category. Some of the conclusions from the work are really important. Almost none of the existing detectors remain robust against all attacks. So there's always some kind of way to get past a detector. And then on average, they're able to drop 35% off of the detection rate across all of the detectors and attacks. So that's pretty startling. And watermarking currently seems to be the most robust approach, but still has issues, right? So if I say, hey, rephrase the whole text, probably the watermarking probably won't survive. Some of my critiques on the paper are that it doesn't really consider closed source attacks or detectors. There's plenty online. So if I have like text output from ChatGPT to do my assignment, there's things online where you can submit your text and it will humanify or basically conduct a closed source attack to beat a detector. There's also open or closed source detectors online that you can submit text to maybe see if it's been written with a given machine. But I guess the problem is that even though this is my critique, the reproducibility would kind of be questionable. But I think it would still be good to at least have a reference point, even if it might not be the same in the future. At least it'd be good to know. Similarly, it'd be good to see some human-involved attacks. Otherwise, things are kind of artificial. The nice thing about the artificial attacks is that they scale quite well. But realistically, the most common attack that I think you would come across would be literally people just having spelling attacks. But if a person is doing that versus if a machine is trying to do that, you'll probably get very, very differing results. And I guess some other things was that it would probably be nice to see the time and space complexity given, maybe not even in big O, but at least some approximations. Please ask me why that's the case, why I think that. As well, some of the ensembling patch approaches could be difficult and problematic to implement depending on how they're used. Again, please ask me why. So here's the paper reference. Thank you so much for listening. I know I just dumped an absolute insane amount of information on all you guys, but I think it's just really interesting to see all the different kinds of attacks and how complex this machine-generated text detection stuff can be against adversaries. So thank you so much.
Thank you, Griffin.